Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome back to the Grow Podcast, episode 75. My name is David. Very excited that you're here. I'm excited we've made it 75 episodes, Pastor Mike.
3/4 of a century.
That's great. Well, you haven't had a comment on the age of the podcast.
I've been thinking about that one for a couple days.
With me, as always, is Pastor Mike. Not always with a comment. For a good 50 episodes, you had a comment every single time about how old the podcast was. I really like your jacket, Pastor Mike.
I did wear this in honor of you.
I feel like we need to spend the first 40 minutes of the podcast today on your jacket.
Not many people may know your other job. Your other job is...
I'm a basketball coach.
Basketball coach for the Wilson High School boys team.
Yep. And you're wearing for those not watching the video podcast, Pastor Mike has a really sweet Jordan jacket on with a Coyote basketball logo on it. It's pretty great.
Because it is now Wilson High School
basketball season has started.
Excited about that?
Yeah, always.
It'll be a great season.
It'll be a tiring season, as always, but it'll be a great season.
It'll be a great season. Hopefully they win despite their coach.
That's the goal.
I mean, their coach will lead them to win. That's what I meant
to say.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us about your illustrious basketball career, Pastor Mike? Tell us.
I think, Is that still on New Hope here? Or is that
that's
video?
A good question. I don't think that... I wasn't in this job when we did that bit, so I'm guessing that never made it to YouTube.
Yeah.
However, we do have a list of, not a list, but like a folder of old, just mostly fun New Hope videos, many from before I even worked or attended here, but I assume that one's got to be in there, right? I would hope so. Yeah. If not, we can find it. But not on YouTube yet. Michael and I have chatted about that needs a playlist on the YouTube channel, just of old, funny New Hope goofiness.
If you're wondering what we're talking about, David attempted to teach me how to play basketball, and I might have exaggerated a little bit, but I also was. And
it didn't take much acting.
Yeah. Not my gift area.
That was the day I learned that Michael,
but my outfit was pretty spectacular.
That is your area of gifting. Yeah. You were dressed for success. That was the day that I learned that Michael, our producer here and worship leader here at the church, can play a little bit of basketball, though. I had never seen him play before. We played a little... I didn't realize just a real brief one-on-one moment, because we were... if you put two former basketball players in... Put them in a gym and there's a basketball there, they're going to start playing basketball. Just by happenstance. And that was before his Achilles exploded. And seems like a long time ago now.
It does.
Maybe we need to head back there. Maybe you've gotten way better. You've lost a lot of weight since then.
With all the practice, that I have not had.
Well, if practice makes perfect, what does doing nothing do?
Make nothing perfect. It's not... Practice doesn't make perfect. Good practice.
Yeah, that's actually perfect. A very good point.
Practice makes permanent.
I know a lot of people that practice a lot of things and don't get better.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where I heard that first, where it says practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent.
That is pretty good.
That's pretty good. You need to use that when you're coaching career.
Just write that down for practice this week.
Practice makes permanent. You got to practice the right things the right way.
Yeah, we do. That's something that I talk about a lot with my players is a kid will get annoyed because I'm harping on the same thing he's doing wrong for the 10th time that week, and he's just like, can you just leave me alone? But if you keep practicing that skill the wrong way, no matter what it is, shooting, dribbling, defense, whatever, if you keep practicing it the wrong way, I can promise you what's going to happen when we get to a game. And that's just so similar to our spiritual life all the time, where if we practice these disciplines wrong. So I like that.
Practicing disciplines wrong thinking makes, you wonder why you get caught in fear, anger, negativity. It's because you practice that kind of thinking. You don't even know you're doing it.
This weekend, you closed out Promised Land. Our second mini-series.
That means that next week we begin.
I'm not sure.
Our Christmas series.
Woo-hoo!
Yes.
Messiah is the name of our Christmas series. Where'd you come up with that, Pastor?
Well, the first week especially, so just the teaser, we're gonna dip back into some of the prophecies about the Messiah and why they matter, how they still make a difference for us. So we're still gonna kind of it's not part of the greatest story ever told, but we'll use some of the same things, some of the upper story kind of perspective and some things of God's at work. Second week, we're going to talk about a little bit more of that, but tie it in with two of the most popular Christmas songs we sing in church.
Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer.
Sing in church.
And Santa Baby. Would those be the two?
Probably not those two.
No, not those two.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that'll be the first 2 weeks.
You're going to be giddy on that day.
Yeah.
Preaching out of Christmas songs.
Yeah. I've already
preaching,
got those two written.
And you really love Christmas songs.
Yeah.
So
it'll be fun.
Yeah. Make sure you join us for All of Messiah.
And we have really some cool things planned for our Christmas Day online. That'll be fun.
Yeah. All of our campuses will be
online on
Christmas Day. And yeah, I think it's gonna be a fun
Christmas Eve. We'll talk more next week about
thing.
Christmas Eve as well as our Christmas overflow offering, where we give all that away, regardless of where you join us from. But
yeah,
it's good.
Yeah. So
let's finish out Promised Land.
Let's talk a little more about David, just like a perfect guy that never made any mistakes. And I think we can just kind of wrap it up from there. Thank you for joining us on the Grow podcast. Now, on the contrary, what you titled your notes for this podcast, so that'll probably become the name of this podcast, is David, an imperfect person following God well. Yeah. Which is, I like that. And very accurate. But you did 2 weeks on David, which we talked about last week on the Grow podcast. We haven't spent 2 weeks on any other, person in the Bible so far. I mean, God. Yeah. God's every week during this series. But spent 2 weeks on him, but there's still a lot that didn't make it. That's one of the reasons why we encourage all of you, make sure you're joining us on the Grow podcast. It's 31 weeks through the Bible, which sounds like a lot until you're like, we're missing a lot of stuff as we go through the Bible in 31 weeks.
So I try to add stuff to the Grow podcast that didn't make it in the weekend teaching. And even there's a ton of stuff that doesn't make it in here because it may be of interest to me or to you, but not necessarily everybody else. And even just because it's of interest doesn't mean that it's helpful always. It's just, that's interesting, kind of thing.
So today you're going to give us some more things from David that you wanted to teach on.
I've got a list of like 75 things.
We'll probably cut you short of 75.
I've got a list in my notes because I didn't know how far we'd make it because we worked through this. So we'll just see how far we make it. Sure. But David is one of my favorite people. You just backed up from the microphone. It's like,
I'm just gonna
lean back and let me talk.
Now the microphone comes with me. See, I can bring it all the way here and get comfortable.
But I just kind of have this running list of things that David's life just reminds me of. And I think one of the most prominent and maybe profound for me personally is that our best growth happens on the battlefield. David was a warrior. We know that about him. But one of the things I admire about David is his commitment to stay on the battlefield. I tend to, when the battle comes up, I tend to want to avoid it. I tend to want to run from it. How do I get out of this? And that's absolutely understandable, right? I mean, no one wants to go, let's go to battle, If you want that, you probably need therapy. It's kind of one of those things. But you think about this early on. David didn't run from Goliath. David was willing to engage in every battle that was necessary. He didn't shy away from those kinds of things. Staying on the battlefield for him wasn't just about swinging swords and defeating physical enemies. The battlefield for him was also about staying loyal. We talked about that a little bit last week. Staying committed, even when everybody said he didn't have to stay committed. Honoring, because God honors even when we don't always deserve it. He honored Saul because Saul was God's choice for king. And he recognized all authority. We'll talk about this hopefully in a minute. All authority comes from God. So when we disrespect or dishonor authority, doesn't mean we always have to obey it when it disagrees with God. But when we disrespect it or dishonor it, we're actually ultimately disrespecting or dishonoring God. And David just stayed on the battlefield. He stayed in a relationship, that he didn't need to stay in with Saul. Was willing to keep coming back to that. He didn't run away from these. And think about this. We've talked about this in different ways. Our greatest growth rarely happens. In fact, I would say never happens when we're comfortable and everything is going well. Our greatest growth is always on the other side of a struggle, or always in the middle of a struggle. So part of it is don't avoid battles. Don't seek them out, but don't avoid the necessary battles, because your growth will happen during those.
There was one battle you mentioned that David wasn't there for.
Yeah. Well, when David chose not to go to the battlefield, and that's part of what we talked about, on this last week of David, he experienced his greatest loss. An affair with Bathsheba, such a nice, pretty word for adultery, for lust, for, giving and things. And it turned into deception and murder of one of his best friends, like we talked about, all because he avoided a battle, because he was tired of the battle. And I get being tired of the battle, but that's when we're the most vulnerable, maybe sometimes, and we need to be ready for that.
Yeah.
The second lesson was one we actually started on last week. Think outside the box, and I put it this way: just because no one had done it doesn't mean it can't be done with God's help. No one had ever defeated Goliath, obviously.
He was still standing there.
You like my statement of the obvious? But that didn't stop David. And when in difficult situations, and I know you've done some study in this, but people who study military tactics read David's stories, and they go, the guy was a master strategist. He didn't do battle the way everybody else did battle, used different battle tactics.
Can I pause you?
Go ahead.
This might not be a relevant question to anybody watching, but it certainly is for me as someone who does love history and enjoy reading about military tactics or anything like that, political things. When I read about David, or even you mentioned it last week too, and said it again this week. David wasn't willing to kill Saul because Saul was anointed, by God to be king, just the same way he was, but. There's a part of my mind that also goes to, well, he also was anointed king, and he certainly doesn't want to establish a standard of it's fine for us to kill the anointed by God king of Israel. But then sometimes I'm like, I'm not trying to take away from the spiritual side of it, which was he trusted God and he knew God is going to take care of this in God's time. And I fully believe that David believe that, but there's a part of me that can't separate he also was probably benefiting from that choice because you don't want to set up the tradition of murdering,
which is a great leadership principle. It's also a great parenting principle. So I have this conversation with leaders all the time where they aren't happy with those higher up the food chain, higher up the organization. Maybe they're part of a larger network, or they're part of a franchise, and we're going to leave. Or churches will do this sometimes. We're going to leave the denomination to do our. And what do? They dishonor, they disrespect, and they may have every right to, because something is going on, something wrong is going on. But here's the conversation I have with leaders: is the way you treat the leaders above you is the way that you're teaching your leaders to treat you. By the way, the same thing is true as a parent. The way you talk about other people, the way you talk about your parents, the way you talk about your kids' teachers, your kids'
coaches,
principals, your kids' coaches.
Just throwing it out there, random idea.
And if you talk about those leaders disrespectfully and dishonoring, I'm not saying you say that bad stuff is okay, but you can acknowledge wrong decisions without being disrespectful. Why are you surprised when your kids disrespect you and dishonor you? You're teaching them to disrespect and dishonor you or their future bosses. And so part of that is just thinking, even there's a loyalty issue. Actually, that ties in with a couple of things later on, where it talks about taking the high road. Don't let how others treated you diminish your future. You think about this. We talked about it last week. His dad and his brothers thought little of him, and yet he didn't. Yet that defined the rest of his life. How many people have let what their parents or their siblings or friends said about them define the rest of their life? Define your life by God's direction. Think outside the box and think in God's box. Saul's treatment of him didn't stop him or give an excuse for bad behavior. Right?
Yeah.
How many times have we said, "Well, because they treated me that, I have a reason"? No, you don't. You don't. And he didn't hold, we touched on this last week, so we won't go any deeper in this, but he didn't hold Saul's mess against Jonathan or later against Mephibosheth. Easy for me to say. I was hoping I would get his name right? By the way, maybe the best person in the whole story of David is Jonathan.
Yeah.
I think better than David.
We certainly don't learn as much about Jonathan, but what we do learn about Jonathan makes him the shining knight of the entire story. I mean,
and that ties in with godly loyalty is a godly thing. We are in a society today that does not honor loyalty. But godly loyalty matters. We abandon, we walk away, we attack leadership, or we abandon and walk away and attack relationships in every area of life these days. David did none of that. And we've talked about that. You know, he never said that what Saul did or the decisions that Saul made were right. Okay? In fact, we find in Psalms complaining a lot to God about the way Saul was treating him. But he said, he's your person, God, you know. So he did not disrespect him. He did not dishonor him in any way, shape, or form. But neither did he stay where Saul could kill him or abuse him.
Yep.
You know, and, you know, loyalty matters. There's a phenomenal book that is worth reading called A Tale of Three Kings, where it talks about Saul and David and Absalom. Saul, or David's son, who treats David the way that David never treated Saul.
Yep.
But David was not a great parent. You know, he just let his kids do whatever they wanted to do. It just teaches us, I think, how to treat leaders and to lead people that we lead or parent with respect and honor without saying that what the decisions that they make that are wrong aren't wrong.
Why doesn't David, being a man after God's own heart, have more of a reflection on his life here on earth in a lot of the areas that most of us have? So like parenting or marriage, or he wasn't great at any of those. I mean, in certain areas, we talked about how loyal he was to Michal, right? He could have easily cut ties with his wife, Michal, and Saul's daughter. I mean, that would have been an easy one to be like, let's not worry about this one anymore. Yeah. But he wasn't loyal to her in terms of, I'm not going to have this affair with Bathsheba. I'm not going to have other wives. And kills Uriah. He's a terrible father. His kids are just disaster zones. Why, you would think that, because there are good parents in the Bible, right? In the Old Testament, even. Like, we learn about people that do a much better job parenting their children. You'd think that if you're a man after God's own heart, it would translate to some of the things that we consider being a good person, right? Being a good parent would be a godly thing.
I think part of this is, I'm going to answer that a little bit differently than you might expect. So,
I expect you to do that. So that's
I was just doing some reading and some study on this lately in another book called Eternity is Now in Session by John Ortberg. But, there are two kinds of ways you measure people are part of things. There's, and the terminology is bounded set or centered set. So a bounded set, if you think of a circle, everybody inside the circle is part of it. So there's this boundary, right? There's this part of it. And people tend to think of following Jesus that as Christianity that way. Once I pray the prayer, once I do whatever, I'm on the inside of the circle. Doesn't matter how close you are to the circle. I don't have to progress towards the closeness of the circle. I'm inside the circle, right? Sure. And so we tend to think of that of what are the boundaries, right? Well, if I'm a man after God's own heart, I'm obviously a great parent. I'm obviously, so, and that's where legalism comes in, right? Sure. Where we create these boundaries, some of them good, some of them not good. Christianity really is more about a centered set. It's about your relationships to who's at the center. And it's all about growing closer to the center. There obviously is a boundary of when am I part of it, but Jesus talked a lot about this. He didn't say just, hey, pray a prayer and you're good. Okay? Now, praying a prayer and asking for forgiveness is part of Scripture. It's part of, now I'm part of his family of God. But now it's possible for me to make the journey towards the center. And I think, like when we look at David's life, we tend to want to measure his leadership by the boundaries, right? Not necessarily bad things, but God's more interested about how much distance are you minimizing between you and me? Are you making progress towards the center? And progress for me is different than progress for you. I'm not talking about morality. I'm talking about progress. So what God wants me to grow in may be different than what he wants you to grow in. Did David need to grow as a parent? You better believe it. He was a pretty sucky parent, at times. Just like, oh, whatever, when someone gets raped. And,
go
whatever.
ahead and assault your sister, kill your brother.
Yeah. And then,
we'll figure it out.
Was mad at the kids for murdering the one who, all these kinds of things. And then just kind of gets passive aggressive about that, which is really weird for a warrior to get passive aggressive about it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And doesn't always deal with conflict well. So like Joab, who is like his chief of staff, caused him all kinds of problems.
Yep.
And he never really deals with it. Just never really takes it until after he's dead. He kind of leaves instructions for it. It's like, hey, after I'm dead, will you deal with that? Kind of thing.
Which is
deal with it yourself.
That goes back to what I said before, where sometimes he has a mafia-like tendencies. It's like, hey, I'm gonna die, and then make sure you take my muscle guy out when I'm done. Otherwise, he might endanger your.
But this goes back to kind of our title for this message, and this is an encouragement. And this is that repeating thread we've been talking about, right? God doesn't call perfect people.
Yeah.
He invites people imperfect people to learn to trust him. And his goal is to help you become a holy person, which ultimately will be a perfect person. Now remember, perfect doesn't mean no longer able to grow. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think perfect implies ongoing growth.
Yeah.
And God says, be holy as I'm holy. And what that means for us is we are constantly growing more like God.
Mm-hmm.
We're constantly more like God. We've often talked about eternity and what eternity is like and about the restoration. Ultimately, eternity is about enjoying being with God constantly without any absence from him. And we think about this. There's no one, including God, that we really want with us 100% 24/7,
Sure,
you think about some choices you've made, you're kind of glad that certain people weren't there when you made the choice to witness those kinds of things. And the point of eternity and the point of God growing us is God growing us to where we want him to be present with us, the desire of our hearts with us all the time. So David desperately wanted God to be with him. That's why he's called a man after God's own heart. So he was, and this is another one of the big things, he was willing to own his mistakes. Now, he needed to be confronted once in a while. He needed accountability once in a while. But a person, I think that's one of the things that defines a person after God's own heart. I'm not a victim, and I'm not making an excuse for my sin. My sin is my sin. And read Psalm 51. David owns it. My sin is my sin. I'm going to make no excuses. God, forgive me. God, restore to me the joy of your salvation. Cleanse me.
Yeah.
Fix this broken heart within me. Mend it within me. That's what matters to God. It's not that we're perfect. It's that we're willing to own it and ask him to help us grow in it. That's a man after God's own heart. And I feel like
or a woman after God's own heart. He dealt with that, like being confronted with it.
Yeah.
And held accountable so well. Which
he could have had Nathan taken out.
Right. I mean, he's the king.
Like, and continue to cover up the whole thing. No one would have ever known except Bathsheba.
And even when we don't have that kind of power, we can still get defensive or make excuses or get confrontational. And I think importantly too, it wasn't just like Earl from the street that could it was a person that he knew. This is a godly person who
Nathan was a friend.
I need to listen to this person that I know loves God and I know cares about me. He's not confronting me for fun. He's doing it
as
because
best
it needs
as we
to
can
happen.
tell in some of the histories and some of the studies, even some of the stuff outside of Scripture, but some of the histories and studies that we found, Nathan probably traveled with him in the desert when he was running from Saul. So I mean, they were tight. They were tight. But here's the tragedy: Uriah was one of them too.
Yeah.
In fact, Uriah was one of his closest friends, captain of his personal guard.
Yeah. I'm going to give you two options. You can either like briefly touch on one or two more, or you can dive deeper into one more thing that you haven't gotten to. But we're running out of time, so you have to pick. Do you want to do a deep dive, or do you just want to touch on a couple and then we can close out?
I don't know that I'll go super deep on this, but one of the things that I think we learned from David is be a worshiper. And again, we touched on this a little bit last week. The more you deal with difficult people, the more time you need to give the process. The higher David went in leadership, the more difficult and dark his days were, the more effort he put into being a worshiper.
Which is not our natural inclination in those moments, yeah.
But part of that is too. Here's a guy who's a warrior, a manly man. I mean, he's the epitome of the Renaissance man, if we can use that phrase. He can do everything well. Everything he does well, and yet he's not afraid to express his emotions, even in ways that his own wife went, "Okay, that was a little much, David." And David's like, "That was for God. I don't care." And he also said, one of my favorite stories of David is when he went to offer a sacrifice to God, and it happened to be in a location where there was a threshing floor. And the guy who owned the threshing, basically a place where they, threshed wheat and harvested wheat, said, "You're the king. This is yours. You can use it free of charge. It's yours, all." And David said, "No, I'm going to pay you for it." And one of the most beautiful statements, I think, in all of Scripture, he says, "I will not offer to God a sacrifice that costs me nothing." Mm-hmm. Worship should cost. If we're just squeezing it into our spare time. Mm-hmm. If sometimes we're saying, if we're saying, "You know what, I'll get up and I'll go to worship when I feel like it," it's costing us nothing, and it isn't really worship. Mm-hmm. And you think about it in terms of a relationship. So you go home to your wife, Joanna, and say, "Joanna, I'll express my love to you only when it's convenient and feels good." Instead of, if I don't like what you're doing, I'm not going to express my love to you. In fact, you can go stand out in the snow until you get over it.
It's aggressive.
Yeah, it is. But, but we do that with God.
Yeah, we do.
Let worship cost you. Be a worshiper. Mm. The reason David was such a great leader is, I think, at a very, very, very young age, he learned, first of all, to be a great worshiper. Mm. And that's a challenge for me personally.
Yeah. Do you have, that could be our homework or next step for the week.
Let's just make that our homework.
I think, I was going to say, I don't know if you have a different one prepared, but
no.
I think finding a way to worship in a way that costs us something would be a good step for all of us this week. Even if even if we're someone who is already good at that, because that, like, David didn't struggle with that. No, but he still made sure, this is important. This has to cost me something if I'm going to give something to God. So, I think that's a good next step for all of us.
And he didn't have the nation pay for it; he paid for it. I mean, he could have had the king's treasury pay for it.
Yeah,
he paid for it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. I've really enjoyed these last couple podcasts on Dave. I mean, I thought we were doing a good job with the Grow podcast, but I think this series, and maybe it's just because we're all in the Old Testament and I love the Old Testament, but I've just really, I feel like the Grow podcast has been really great the last, 12? We're 12 weeks in now to Greatest Story Ever Told?
Yeah, 12 weeks
So the last 12 have been really a pleasure.
And we'll come back at 1st of January. Not the first Sunday of January, but second Sunday of January. We're going to come back. We're going to start with talking about the Kings. We're calling it 23andMe the next few weeks.
Do you want to explain why it's called that, or are we going to wait on that?
2023.
Okay. I didn't know if it was a first line of the first message you were saving that.
And the lives of the kings, man, so many of them could be our stories. We are kings, but man, their stories are our stories. So.
Well, thank you again, everybody, for joining us. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure that you subscribe to the Grow Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Leave us a comment. Let us know how you think we're doing. Let us know how cool Pastor Mike's. We haven't spammed the comments with how cool Pastor Mike's clothing is in a while.
You just want it because
it's
I'm
Coyote
surprised
basketball.
You aren't giving like a Coyote basketball website to buy. No, you cannot do that.
By the time this goes out, our store is closed. So unfortunately, that won't work. But come to a game and say hello. I'd love to see you after the game. But so everybody jump in the chat or in the comment box right now and let Pastor Mike know how cool his Jordan Coyote basketball jacket is.
That's purely selfish on your part.
Well, we've normally I do this at the beginning. This will be a good test for us. When I say this at the beginning of a podcast, I feel like we get a good number of comments. We'll see how many of you have stuck with us 30 minutes in to comment on Pastor Mike's cool jacket. But we love all of you. We're looking forward to continuing with you as we go into this Messiah Christmas series, and we will see you next time.